Beautiful soul. Right now, in this very moment, the angels are wrapping their wings around you. They are sending you a love so warm, so steady, so real, that if you close your eyes for just a second, you might actually feel it. A gentle warmth on your shoulders, a softness in the air around you, a quiet knowing in your chest that says, you are not alone. You were guided here today, not by accident, not by coincidence, but by something much greater than either of us can fully explain. Heaven has a message for you, and the angels asked me to deliver it with care, with love, and with complete truth. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You original channel. This is our only official channel. Please beware of copycat and pirated channels, and stay connected to the original source for authentic angel messages and true blessings. A very special thank you to Michael, Patricia Da, and Calzi for sowing your seed for Soulmate here through Ko-Fi link. Super thanks. May this seed return to you multiplied with soulmate blessings, divine protection, love, well-being, and abundance. May the angels guide and watch over you always. Thank you for your beautiful support. Blessings always. Beloved soul, today the angels came to me with something urgent. Something that has been building in the spiritual realm for quite some time now. The energy around you has been changing. You may have already noticed it without being able to name it. A restlessness in your heart. A sensitivity you cannot explain. Emotions rising to the surface at unexpected moments. Thoughts drifting toward someone you have tried not to think about too much. That stirring inside you, the angels want you to know, it is not random. It is not just your mind playing tricks on you. What you have been feeling is a spiritual signal. A very real, very powerful connection activating between you and the one whose heart beats for you on a soul level. Your soulmate, the one who is already tied to you in the unseen. Their longing for you has grown so strong, so consuming, so undeniable, that it has crossed from feeling into decision, from quiet longing into clear, deliberate action. Heaven heard the prayers of this love. And heaven sent this message to you because you deserve to know what is already in motion before it arrives at your door. Your soulmate wants to come to you, to be with you in the most real, present, physical way, to spend an entire day by your side. Looking into your eyes, sitting in your space, breathing the same air, feeling your energy up close without any walls between you. Not as someone passing through. Not as a quick moment of nostalgia. What this person carries for you is not casual. It is not a whim. It is a deep, true, living love that has survived time and distance and every reason it could have found to let go. And it did not let go, because you are the one. You have always been the one. And on some quiet level, you already know this. But here is what the angels most want you to receive today. One day will not be enough. Your soulmate already understands this. This first day, the one being planned, the one being prayed for in the stillness of early mornings and late nights. It is not a visit. It is a beginning. It is the first step of something that was written in the stars long before either of you understood what love truly was. Think about that for a moment. A whole lifetime was set in motion so that your path and this person's path would eventually lead here. To this moment, to this message, to what is about to unfold between you. Your soulmate's longing for you did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, quietly, the way the deepest and most important things always do. It was nourished by prayers whispered in the dark. By memories that simply refused to lose their light no matter how much time passed. By a feeling that no distraction, no busyness, no amount of telling themselves to move on could ever silence. The further time moved, the louder this love became. And now it has reached a point, a real, undeniable point where waiting is simply no longer possible. This person has already pictured coming to you, has already imagined the path to your door, has already felt the nervous, beautiful, heart-pounding excitement of what it would mean to finally stand before you, to look into your eyes and say without words, "I am here. I am choosing you. I am still choosing you. After everything, after all the time and all the distance and all the silence, I am still choosing you." And you, dear soul, you have felt it too. You may not have been able to name it. You may have brushed it off, told yourself it was nothing, tried to be practical about it. But in the quiet moments, in the in-between spaces of your day, something kept pulling at you. Thoughts that came from nowhere. A name that drifted through your mind unexpectedly. A feeling like something important was approaching, like the air itself was charged with something you could not quite see yet. That is not your imagination running away with you. That is the real, living spiritual connection between you and your soulmate pulsing with energy. That is two souls moving closer to the moment they were always meant to share. The angels see this connection. They see it like a golden thread of light stretching between two hearts across any distance. And right now, that thread is pulling tight. The space between you is collapsing. What was far is drawing near. What was uncertain is becoming clear. And the angels want you to be ready when it arrives. This love does not want to reach you through dreams or through the ghost of old memories anymore. It wants to reach you in real life, in the here and now. It wants to walk into your world, sit beside you, hear your voice without having to imagine what it sounds like. It wants to feel the warmth of being near you, truly near you, for a whole day. No rush, no agenda, no performance, just presence. Just the kind of honest, unhurried, soul-level connection that only becomes possible between two people who were made for each other. What your soulmate is feeling right now is not a passing impulse. This decision was not made quickly or lightly. It was built carefully, layer by layer, through nights of reflection and prayer and honest self-examination. This person sat with the feeling, questioned it, tested it, waited to see if it would fade. And it did not fade. It only grew clearer, more certain, more steady. The conclusion your soulmate arrived at is this: life without you in it does not feel complete. No amount of busyness or distraction or moving on has been able to fill the place that belongs to you. And now this person is done pretending otherwise. Now this love is ready to do something about it. Your home, your space, the everyday world you have built for yourself. That is where this person wants to be. Not because of what it looks like, not because of what it represents, but because you are there. And you are the reason any space becomes sacred. Your soulmate has thought long and carefully about what it would feel like to simply be in your world. To see you move through your day, to hear the natural sound of your voice when you are at ease, to notice the small details that only someone who truly loves you would ever notice, the way you smile when something catches you off guard, the way your hands move when you talk about something you care about, the way you breathe when you finally feel safe. And this thought, this vision has become a need. A real, beautiful, undeniable need that this person can no longer ignore. Your soulmate wants to sit beside you without any agenda. No big plan. No prepared speech. No trying to be impressive. Just the two of you in the same space, sharing something simple, a quiet conversation, a slow and unhurried afternoon, the peaceful feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be with exactly the person you are supposed to be with. This love does not need grand gestures to feel real. It only needs you, and it is ready to show you that through presence, through action, through every small and tender thing it is already preparing to give you. Dear one, you are someone's answered prayer. Let that land. You are not just a hope or a passing wish in this person's heart. You are the dream this love keeps returning to, not out of loneliness, not out of habit, not out of having nothing better to hold on to, but because you are genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably the one who makes this heart feel whole. The one who brings a kind of peace that cannot be found anywhere else. The one whose presence changes the quality of everything around them. Your name lives in this person's prayers. Your face appears in the quietest moments, the ones where truth is loudest and pretending is impossible. Your love is the answer your soulmate has been walking toward for longer than they may have fully understood. This connection between you did not fade with time. If anything, time acted as a refiner's fire. It burned away everything that was surface level and left only what was real. Every day that passed without you was another day that proved just how rare and irreplaceable you are. No substitute could hold the same weight. No other connection carried the same depth. And that truth became the foundation upon which a decision was made. So here is what is coming for you. Beloved, this love is moving closer. The spiritual path between you is being cleared by divine hands. The angels are working in the unseen right now, aligning moments, preparing hearts, removing every barrier that was ever placed between you and this love. What once felt distant is drawing near. What once felt uncertain is crystallizing into clarity. And that first day, the one your soulmate has prayed over and imagined 1,000 times, is closer than you think. When it happens, you will feel it the moment your eyes meet. You will not need a long explanation or a carefully constructed argument. You will simply know. Something inside you will recognize what is standing before you. Not just a person, but a promise, a belonging. And in that recognition, something will open in you that has been guarded for a long time. Because here is the truth the angels want you to hold close. The one coming to you is not coming to take from you. They are not coming to revisit old wounds or to make demands or to ask you to shrink yourself into something manageable. They are coming to give, to pour out, to show you, through every look, every word, every moment of that day and every day that follows, that this love is real, that it is ready, and that it chose you before it had the language to say so. You have been moving through your days with a quiet ache, a longing that sometimes felt too big to name and too persistent to ignore. Maybe you told yourself it was just the past. Maybe you tried to be sensible about it. Maybe you told yourself that the feeling meant nothing, that it was just a memory with no future. But it kept coming back. The wondering, the sense that something essential was still unfinished. The heart's stubborn, beautiful refusal to forget. That is not weakness, dear soul. That is your soul keeping the door open for what is meant to walk through it. And what is meant to walk through it is already on its way. Your soulmate has not replaced you, has not found peace in settling for something smaller, has not closed the chapter that you both share, because closing it was never truly possible. Not when the love is this real, not when the connection runs this deep. The feeling has survived every season, every change, every distance. And what survives like that is not a coincidence. It is destiny making itself known. The angels want you to understand something important. This is not just about a reunion. This is about a beginning, a real, chosen, clear-eyed, fully intentional beginning. Your soulmate is not coming to you caught in old patterns or old pain. This person has done the inner work, has looked honestly at what went wrong, at what could be different, at what it would truly take to be ready for a love like this. And the answer that came was, I am ready now. I want to try again. I want to do it right this time, and I want to do it with you. Before we go deeper into today's message, if you feel guided by this energy, you can sow your seed for your soulmate's well-being and protection through the Ko-Fi link Super Thanks in the description or pinned comment. This is a simple way to support this divine mission and invite blessings for your soulmate journey, emotional healing, and overall well-being. Many believe that when you give with a pure heart, it returns as love, peace, happiness, and abundance in your life. What is returning to you is a version of this love that is more mature, more steady, more anchored in truth. Not the kind of love that burns hot and fades quickly, but the kind that has been tested and strengthened by every challenge that tried to break it. The kind the angels celebrate. The kind that changes lives from the inside out. This person wants to be your everyday, not just the highlights, not just the beautiful, curated moments that look good from the outside, but the ordinary Tuesday mornings when neither of you has slept well enough. The tired evenings when the world felt too heavy and words are hard to find. The quiet Sunday afternoons when there is nowhere to be and nothing to perform. This love wants to be woven into the ordinary fabric of your life because that is where real love actually lives. In the showing up, in the staying, in the choosing each other again and again without an audience. Your soulmate has already imagined what it would feel like to share a life with you. To know that at the end of every day you are there. To wake up to the particular peace that only comes from being with the right person. To have someone to turn to not because of obligation, not because of fear, but because the heart chooses it freely. Every single day. Take a quick second before we move forward. Many channels are reposting and copying our content, but authentic energy cannot be duplicated. For the strongest positive connection and divine guidance, always listen from the original Angel's Message for You channel with the black logo base. Now, let's continue with the message your angels want you to hear. That is the life being spiritually prepared for you right now. That is the intention being carried in your direction. This person does not want to love you from a distance anymore. The heart has spoken, and it has spoken clearly. Said, stop waiting. Stop being afraid. The love you feel is real and it deserves to be lived. Life is too short and too uncertain to keep sitting on something this important. Go now. And so the movement has begun, not just in the seen world, but in the spiritual one. The angels are confirming what your soul already senses. Something is changing. Something is unfolding. Something is drawing you and this person together with a force that is quiet but absolute. And you are right in the center of it, beloved. This is happening for you, not to you, for you. You do not need to do anything dramatic to receive this. You do not need to force it or orchestrate it or explain it to anyone who might not understand. What the angels are asking of you is much simpler than that. Stay open. Let your heart stay soft. Release the armor that past pain taught you to wear. Truly allow yourself to believe that what is coming is different. Because it is different. The love arriving now has been refined by time. It has been proven by endurance. It has been purified by everything it survived to reach you. That is not an ordinary love. That is a love that was built to last. When your soulmate stands before you on that first day, you will feel something settle in your chest. A recognition, a homecoming, a quiet, profound sense of, oh, there you are. I knew you were coming. I have been waiting for you even when I tried to pretend I was not. And in that moment, you will understand that everything that felt like waiting was actually preparation. Your heart was being made ready. The universe was rearranging things behind the scenes. And now everything that was moved into place is about to reveal itself to you. This first day will only be the beginning, dear one. Your soulmate knows this. One day will not be enough to hold everything this love has been saving up. It is the first chapter of something that was always meant to be written. And after that day, after that first look, that first real conversation, that first moment of just existing together in the same space, the intention is not to leave. The intention is to stay, to build, to grow together, to love you the way you have always deserved to be loved. Openly, consistently, without fear, without games, without end. You are not too much for this love. You are not too broken. You are not too guarded. You are not too late. You are exactly who this person has been walking toward. You do not need to earn this love or perform for it or shrink yourself to fit inside it. Your soulmate has already seen you, really, honestly, fully seen you, and chose to keep moving in your direction. That is not something the universe hands out casually. That is something sacred. Let the angels speak directly to that fear that sometimes whispers you have been hurt before. You know the voice. The one that reminds you of times when love did not stay, when promises turned out to be hollow, when you opened your heart and it did not go the way you had hoped. The angels see that part of you too, and they want you to know your past does not disqualify you from this. Prepared you for it. Every heartbreak that taught you something, every disappointment that deepened your discernment, every season of loneliness that showed you what you truly value. All of it was working for you, not against you. And the love coming. Your way has also been shaped by its own journey. Your soulmate has lived through things that created growth, has been humbled and softened and made wiser by life. This is not someone who is arriving empty-handed or unprepared. This is someone who has done the inner work and arrived ready to give you something real. This person wants to love you responsibly, to create a safe space beside you, to show you through consistent, daily, unhurried action that you do not have to carry everything alone anymore, that there is someone standing with you, someone who will not disappear when things get complicated. Someone who will sit with you in the hard places and not need you to pretend everything is fine. Someone who will still be there on the morning after a difficult night. The affection being prepared for you is sincere. It is not built on grand speeches or romantic performances. It is built on a love that endured difficult seasons without fading. A love that prayed for you even in your absence. A love that stayed strong enough through waiting to arrive at your door still whole, still warm, still completely yours. Your soulmate wants to show you that it is worth trusting again, that it is worth opening again, that the risk of loving fully is always, always worth taking when the love is real. And this love is real. The angels are confirming it. Heaven is bearing witness to it. And your own soul, if you listen past the noise of your doubts, already knows it. Think about what your soulmate has been quietly planning. The life being envisioned includes you in every part of it. Not just the easy parts, not just the beautiful parts, all of it. The routines, the responsibilities, the small daily rituals that make a life feel like home. This person wants to know your habits, understand your rhythms, respect the space you need, and add to everything you have already built. Not take over it, not erase it, but add to it. Wants to be your support on the days when the weight of the world feels like too much, and wants to share in the joy on the days when life feels effortless. This love wants to wake up with you, to see you in the morning before the day has required anything of you. To hear the way your voice sounds when you are still halfway between sleep and waking. To sit with you over something warm and simple and feel the particular comfort of being exactly where you belong. And to fall asleep at night knowing they are beside the one who truly matters. Not as a wish, as a reality. More than sharing a space, this person wants to share a life, wants to carry you in the most beautiful and loving sense of that word, to be the one who waits for you, who celebrates when you succeed and holds you gently when you fall short, who listens to the things you are afraid to say out loud and does not flinch, who finds joy in your joy and takes your struggles seriously, who shows up again and again, not because they have to but because there is nowhere they would rather be. Your soulmate has already seen you in the future, already felt the wish to include you in plans, in decisions, in the small daily choices that add up to a whole life, already felt the desire to care for you in every sense, not to change you, not to fix you, but to honor you, to love the version of you that shows up on the hard days as much as the version that shows up on the good ones, because that is what real love does. It stays for all of it. This is not a promise made in a moment of emotion. This is a real desire that has been thought through, prayed over, and matured into a decision. And it is a decision that has you at its center. You are the reason. You are the presence. You are the heartbeat behind the choice. Dear one, your soulmate's desire to spend that first day with you does not end with that day. The angels want you to hear this clearly. One day is the door, and on the other side of that door is a whole life, a shared morning, a shared evening, a shared story that has been waiting for both of you to finally step into it fully and without reservation. The first day carries within it the seed of everything that follows. And what follows is everything your heart has been quietly hoping for, even on the days when hope felt foolish. Constant presence, true partnership, the kind of love that does not need to be performed for anyone else because it is real enough to sustain itself in private. A love that makes a home in the ordinary, in the imperfect, in the real. You were not chosen by chance. The connection between you and this person was not created by accident or by circumstance or by simply being in the right place at the right time. It was designed. It was written into both of your stories before either of you were old enough to understand what love really meant. And the fact that you are here reading this message today is part of that design. The angels planned for you to receive this confirmation, because they wanted you to be ready. They wanted your heart to be open. They wanted you to know before it happens that what is coming is real and that it deserves to be received with openness and with faith. So let yourself receive it. Let your shoulders drop. Let that knot in your chest loosen a little. The angels are wrapping you in their warmest light right now, and they are saying, you did not wait in vain. You did not hope for nothing. The love you have been carrying for longer than you care to admit is about to have somewhere real to land. Your soulmate is coming with a full heart, steady eyes, and a decision already made deep in the soul. No games, no mixed messages, no making you wonder or question or shrink yourself trying to figure out where you stand. This love is coming with clarity, with commitment, with the genuine, wholehearted desire to be present in your life, not just for a moment, but for as long as life allows. And from that first day forward, everything will begin to change. Not because the world around you will suddenly be different, but because something inside you will awaken. Something that has been waiting quietly for exactly this. A remembering, a recognizing, a settling into the truth that you were made for this kind of love, and this kind of love was made for you. The angels bless you now with peace that reaches into the deepest parts of you, with clarity that cuts right through the noise of fear and doubt, with the unshakable knowing that love, true, lasting, soul-deep love, is not finished with you. It is just getting started. You are held, beloved. You are guided. You are celebrated by heaven. And the one who was always meant to love you here on earth is already on their way. Receive it. Open to it. Trust it. You always were worthy of this. You always were. And there is something else the angels want to say to you before this message closes. Something they asked me to save for the end, because it is the part that will stay with you the longest. You have spent so much time wondering if you are lovable. Wondering if the things that make you who you are, your sensitivity, your depth, the way you feel things more intensely than the world sometimes seems comfortable with, are things that will eventually push love away. You have loved people and watched them leave and told yourself, maybe quietly and only in the most private spaces of your heart, that maybe something about you makes lasting love impossible. The angels want to look you directly in the eyes right now and tell you, that is not the truth. That has never been the truth. What you are is not too much. What you feel is not a problem to be managed. You are exactly the kind of soul that a real and lasting love is drawn to because you are real. You are genuine. You are not interested in pretending. You do not perform your feelings. You love fully and honestly and with your whole self, and that is not a flaw. That is a gift. That is one of the most beautiful things about you. Your soulmate knows this. That is part of why you are the one this love keeps returning to. Because the world is full of people who are easy to be around on the surface, but rare is the one whose depth you want to keep exploring. Rare is the one who makes you feel like the truest version of yourself simply by being present. Rare is the one you would give up comfortable distance for. And you are that person for your soulmate. You are the rare one. Let that settle into you now. Really let it in. You are not waiting to be loved because you are lacking something. You have been waiting because what is meant for you does not come cheaply or easily or without meaning. What is meant for you was being built. And it is finished now. It is ready. And it is coming. The angels also want to speak to the part of you that has been quietly praying. Maybe you have not told anyone. Maybe you have not even fully admitted it to yourself. But somewhere in the stillness, in the early morning, in the last moment before sleep, in the unexpected quiet that falls when life slows down just enough, you have asked for this. You have said, with or without words, that you want to be loved, that you want to feel seen, that you want a real, true, lasting connection with another soul who chooses you every day. Heaven heard that prayer every single time you sent it. Every single time. And this message today is part of the answer. The angels are not showing you what could happen someday in some distant, maybe world. They are showing you what is already in motion. What has already been set into action. What is already drawing itself toward you with every passing day. Your soulmate's heart is pointed at you. It has been for longer than you know. And now the distance between where things are and where they are going to be has shrunk to almost nothing. The spiritual path between you is lit up. The angels are walking alongside both of you, guiding each step toward the moment when you are finally in the same place at the same time with open hearts and nowhere to hide. And when that moment comes, and it is coming, the angels want you to let yourself be surprised by how good it feels. Not in a fairy tale way. Not in a way that ignores reality or asks you to pretend nothing difficult ever happened. But in the way that only real love can surprise you, by being better than what you had feared, by being warmer than you remembered, by being more steady and more sure than your most hopeful imagination could have drawn up. Your soulmate is not coming to you as a fantasy. This person is coming as a real, grown, imperfect, fully committed human being who has decided that you are worth every risk love asks of them. That is better than a fantasy. That is the real thing. And real love, when it finally arrives and you let yourself receive it, has a way of making everything that came before it make sense. all the waiting, all the growing, all the painful seasons that you could not see the purpose of at the time. It all led here, to you, to this moment, to the beginning of what is next. The angels want to leave you with this truth as their final blessing for today. You are loved, right now, exactly as you are. Not the version of you that has it all figured out. Not the version of you that has healed every wound and resolved every fear. The you that exists right now, searching, feeling, hoping, wondering that person is loved by heaven without condition or qualification. And that person is about to be loved here on earth by someone who sees them clearly and chooses them anyway. Open your heart. Stay soft. Keep believing. The love that is meant for you is patient and it is powerful and it does not give up. It never gave up on you. Not once. Go forward into your day knowing that the angels are with you. Knowing that heaven is working on your behalf in ways both seen and unseen. Knowing that what is yours is already yours. It is just finishing its journey to you. And it is almost there. Dear beautiful soul, this angel's message for you channel is a sacred spiritual home, created for faith, healing, and divine guidance. A place where hearts awaken and lives are gently transformed through divine messages. We warmly invite you to subscribe and stay connected, because the divine is always preparing something greater for your journey, something you are meant to receive in divine timing. If you feel moved to support this mission, you can sow your seed here for your soulmate blessings and divine love fulfillment. Your contribution is not just support. It is an energetic agreement with love, healing, and divine alignment in your own life. When you give with intention, it opens doors. Love flows more freely, happiness expands, and abundance multiplies in unexpected ways. Many believe that giving in faith activates a return of peace, joy, and emotional fulfillment in relationships and life. Whether it is $11, $22, $33, or $55, your generosity helps us continue spreading these divine messages of hope, healing, and soulmate guidance across the world. Every seed sown into this mission helps hearts heal, faith return, and souls reconnect with love. This is more than a channel. It is a movement of light, unity, and divine timing. Your support allows this sacred work to grow, touching lives that are searching for answers, comfort, and spiritual direction. We are all connected in this journey, and together we rise as one community under divine love. Let us open our hearts to the abundance that is already on its way. Amen.